This presentation is brought to you by the MFOA.
Hello, my name is Craig Binning. I'm a partner at Hemson Consulting, and over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm just going to provide a bit of an overview on this new provision under the Planning Act for the Community Benefits Charge, which is a mechanism that is going to now allow municipalities to fund some development or growth-related costs that were previously funded through other mechanisms. Currently, municipalities use provisions under the Development Charges Act to fund what we often refer to as soft services or general services. And the primary ones for most municipalities are recreation facilities, libraries, and park development. Those are going to, as of next year, no longer be fundable from development charges and move into this new regime under the Planning Act. In addition to that, the parkland dedication provisions of the Planning Act, or the cash in lieu, are also going to be discontinued and fall into this new funding envelope under the community benefits charge. Also, there's a few municipalities that use Section 37, which allows municipalities to ask developers to make additional contributions when increased height and density is permitted. And they collect charges to fund certain community benefits. All three of these things are now going to be moved into this new regime under the Planning Act called the Community Benefits Charge. And what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about what this new regime looks like. Unfortunately, at the time of making this recording, we still did not have the final regulations on the CBC, so there's still things to be determined. I would just want to quickly talk about what is going to be eligible under the new regime. Basically, the legislation doesn't tell us what services can be funded through the CBC, but rather what services can't. The first important exception is that services that are eligible for funding under the amended Development Charges Act cannot be included in a CBC recovery. Those include the engineered services of water, wastewater, roads, stormwater management, and then also the services of transit and the protection services of police, fire, and land ambulance, and also waste diversion. In addition, the Planning Act regulations, or Act, provide for additional exemptions for services as prescribed. And currently, the regulations prohibit us from recovering for cultural and entertainment facilities, tourism facilities, hospitals, landfill sites, waste incineration, and general administration. Those are the same exceptions that were included under the Development Charges Act, so that's nothing new for us. And then basically what this is saying is that all other services are eligible for funding from the CBC regime as long as there's a development or growth-related impact. As we move forward then, some of the interesting things about this new proposed regime is that there is no maximum lifespan to a bylaw passed under the CBC regime. That might change once we get the regulations, but currently that's the case. The Act also requires that a CBC strategy be developed, and we're going to talk a little bit later on in the presentation about what that might include. But it's certainly at a minimum going to require you to identify specific projects that you propose to fund through the collections under the CBC regime. And indeed, they're going to need to be development and growth related. And then finally, the regulations may provide additional prescription on how we include those services and what must be included in the strategy. Another important thing is that the charges are going to be capped as a share of the value of a site. So each development as it comes forward, the land value of that development on the day before the building permit is issued, there'll be a certain percentage for which the charges cannot be higher than. And it's going to be the municipality's responsibility to establish what the value of the sites are. And then the developer can actually get their own appraisal to dispute what the appraised value of the site is. So you can get a sense that there's going to be some additional cumbersome to this process that isn't currently there under the Development Charges Act or some of the other provisions. Now, I've talked about these or mentioned these percentages, and this is the real sticking point, and this is the area that we don't have the regulations on yet about what the percentages are likely going to be. Importantly, the Minister of Municipal Affairs has indicated publicly and in writing that the CBC regime should be revenue neutral to municipalities, and that municipalities will be able to fund the same amount of costs that they could under the prevailing development charge regime and the Planning Act provisions for parkland dedication, cash in lieu, and also Section 37. Based on our experience and from information that has been provided, we anticipate that there's going to be a range of percentages, and those percentage ranges are going to vary in two distinct ways. One, it's likely that there'll be some geographic delineation or grouping of municipalities, and there'll be different percentages for this grouping of municipalities. And the groupings are likely going to be a function of a combination of things, including the size of the municipality, i.e. population, also the location of that municipality, whether you're in the GTA, Southern Ontario, or perhaps Northern Ontario, and then also consideration of whether you have urban centers and urban development, or whether it's more of a rural profile. We also anticipated, and have actually asked, that there be different percentages for different types of development. So within the residential, we hope that there'll be a different percentage for high density development, and perhaps a different one for low density development, and maybe even one for medium density. And then likewise, with non-residential development, we would anticipate that there will be a different percentage, but perhaps one that's applicable to all types of non-residential development. But that's the key thing that we're waiting for right now. I'm going to touch on a few of those points as we move through the presentation. I just want to comment briefly about this concept of revenue neutrality, because it's a very hard one to imagine that it can be achieved uniformly across the province for all municipalities and all types of developers. As soon as we do some groupings, which is what the province said it's going to do, there will be winners and losers, and there's going to be winners and losers in terms of municipalities. Some will have the ability to collect more money than they could previously, and some less, unless there's some other additional rules put in place. Also, once you establish your rates at the municipal level, it's highly likely that there'll be some developments that pay more than they would have under the current regime and some that will pay less. And so there could be some conflict amongst the different users in different municipalities. One of the other things that we're concerned about is trying to understand the predictability of the revenue stream, because municipalities are now going to have to forecast the amount of land that's going to get developed and the value of that land and what the revenue might be from the CBC regime. So there's going to be some additional complications when it comes to doing your budgeting and planning moving forward. As I said, we're in a bit of a transitional period right now. We have the legislation in place. We've seen some sort of draft overview regulations, but we don't have the specifics that are necessary to even understand or implement and calculate a CBC regime at this time. The current timing indicates that as of January 1st, 2020, municipalities could begin to implement a CBC bylaw. We can't do that today because we don't have the information, but hopefully we will sometime very soon. There also is an end date currently that says by the end of 2020, December 31st, or January 1st, 2021, a municipality must have a CBC bylaw in place if they wish to continue to fund those discounted services and parkland acquisition and Section 37. If you don't have a CBC bylaw in place at that time, any prevailing development charge rates for those services will discontinue, and you will not be able to levy a Section 37 type of charge either. So it's going to be a busy year next year. With respect to DC collection and administration, currently the legislation doesn't prescribe exactly when the charge would be collected, but it does indicate that the cap is set at the day before the building permit is issued, the value of the land on that date. So our working assumption is that collection would likely be at the issuance of the building permit, consistent with the way development charges are collected today. However, we're aware that members of the development industry are asking that the CBCs be set and collected, or certainly set and potentially collected at some point earlier in the development stage. So we're wondering whether or not the regulations might actually provide a bit more prescription in terms of when the charges are set and collected. And then also the have already identified that there are going to be some statutory exemptions under the proposed regulations, i.e. that development of certain types, municipalities will not be able to levy a CBC charge against them. They include at this time long-term care homes, retirement homes, universities and colleges, memorial homes, hospices, and nonprofit housing. We're yet to see a definition on those terms, but we hope that that comes forward in the regulations as well. And then just moving forward with some of our other thoughts on this process. We think that over time, what's likely to happen is that planning will likely play a heightened role in the CBC process because it requires the look at land and how much land is going to be developed and the parkland needs and such. And so planning is very much involved in the day-to-day activities of those. Over the past decade or so, really it's been the finance department that's played the chief role in development charges. So we think the process will require better coordination and collaboration amongst departments, with both planning and financing playing leading roles in the process. So some of the knowns and the unknowns currently, as I say, there's just things that we don't know, but starting with the things that we do know is that we will be able to continue to fund development-related municipal infrastructure for a range of services, but it's going to change. We also know that municipalities are going to need some new and different resources in order to implement the CBC regime. But at the same time, we generally view that the new program and the provisions are more flexible than the CBC, the current development charge regime, which should help municipalities address certain priorities within their municipality. The things that we don't know, and the most important one that I've already discussed, is that we don't know what the caps are going to be and what these percentages are going to be or how they're structured. There's also some uncertainty about the transition from the current regime to the new CBC regime, and it's also difficult to understand and fully quantify how this is going to affect our capital planning, service levels, and taxes moving forward. So unfortunately, there's a lot of things still to be determined. This next slide just really gives you a high-level schematic over how the land value percentages are likely going to be determined. We've been party to some of the work that the province has been doing, and their vendor has been doing a very rigorous job at trying to quantify the development charges collected, plus the cash in lieu of parkland or value of the land being dedicated, plus Section 37 benefits, and then divided those over the value of the development that's occurred over specified planning horizons to arrive at those percentages. And as you can anticipate, those percentages are very different from one municipality to the next and from one development to another development within each municipality, which creates that complexity that I think explains why the province is somewhat delayed in releasing the regulations specifying what those percentages might be. So some of you are wondering, well, what might a CBC strategy look like? Remembering that it's going to be necessary to provide these in order as a justification for the charge. I think it's a good thing that the provisions are not terribly prescriptive, which should give us enhanced flexibility about how we want to set the charges, what we include, the priorities, and the spending of the monies. I keep coming back to this, but the prescribed percentages are going to be the thing that really drives how we determine these things. So until we see those and the finalization of the regulations, it's a bit difficult to know exactly how we're going to structure things. It could, however, mean that municipalities impose CBC charges by different types of development or by location, and you can have that flexibility to do that as long as you're not exceeding the prescribed caps. You will likely want to establish rules for apportioning site values between different types of development with different densities and other factors that are specific to your municipality. And like the development charges bylaws today, we're probably going to want to look to create certain rules around how different land areas are treated and how charges are collected and how we deal with circumstances of development and redevelopment and intensification and when the charges are payable. This next schematic, and I won't spend too much time on it, is just trying to identify where there might be some nuances and specific rules to be developed. Developments in rural areas where property values are likely lower than more urbanized areas may require a bit of a more creative thinking about how to establish the charges. Also, when we get into mixed-use developments, a combination of residential and non-residential, and there may be two different caps applicable, how do we go about doing that and proportioning the land value, because those buildings will be on one common site of land. And then finally, industrial can be quite complex because often they're large land areas, but that they're developed over time. And so how does one apportion the site to actual buildings that are being constructed at different periods of time, recognizing that there'll likely be a phasing of the development to full build out of the lands. So those are some of the things that we'll deal with, but I think they'll be best dealt with on a municipality by municipality basis. Thinking ahead, some of the things that you're going to want to think about for 2020 is that hopefully you've given some consideration in your budget for next year for undertaking a CBC study. Also, you may want to realize or think about trying to get an appraiser lined up or having a roster of appraisers, because you're going to need some of those. And we're also recommending that you consider having some legal assistance for crafting the first CBC round of bylaws. Also, the list of projects and how growth related are those, and what are the priorities within them, and are there shares that aren't growth related? It's going to be very similar to the development charge background study, and your most recent study should help inform what you're doing moving forward. The third piece here, there's the land value forecast. That's something new for us. We're going to have to look at how much land we think is going to get developed and what the value of that land is. We're going to probably want to look at the amount and the type and the location of those lands and whether the land values vary across your municipality. So that really is going to be a complex part of this process. The fourth one, although not required, and we're not going to be probably looking at 10-year historic service levels, we at Hemson think it's going to be important to give consideration to service levels and that they should inform the determination of growth related and the shares of projects that are indeed growth related. The legislation also stipulates with the strategy, doesn't really give it a time frame or the life of the bylaw. We think that these should be living documents, not that you'll have to update the bylaw every year, but you're probably going to want to update your strategy and your list of projects internally every year to identify what the needs are if they're changing over time. And we also think that it might be valuable to do these studies concurrent with their development charge updates, because there's an overlap of the development forecast of the stakeholders and interested parties. And there is definitely continued correlation between development charge fundable services and those now fundable under the new CBC regime. And also there's a definite link with your asset management planning. And so moving these things forward in a consistent and coordinated manner is probably the most efficient thing to do. The CBC legislation also indicates that there's the requirement of a public process, but it's reasonably silent upon what that might mean. We would think that you'll probably want to mirror in with your development charge process, and if you're not doing it concurrent with your development charge study, we would recommend that you do something similar, engage with the developers, engage with the general public, engage with council to ensure that they understand what the projects is that you're proposing to fund, that nexus or relationship with development, and why they're important to your community to build complete communities that are livable and enjoyable for all residents. And certainly the CBCs should tie in with the municipality's strategic plan, your land use planning, and other economic development goals and priorities of your council. Just to finish up, some of you may be wondering about the fund management. It is a requirement under the legislation right now that on an annual basis, you have to identify to either spend or allocate 60% of the monies that have been collected. I wouldn't get too worried about that allocation, because clearly municipalities on an annual basis, I think, should be able to look at those allocations and say, we've re-identified our priorities. But you are going to have to go through that process of your list of projects and prioritizing where you think the money is going to be spent and where 60% of it is going to be spent moving forward. There also will be issues around what about the existing development charge reserve fund monies for these services and your parkland cash lieu reserves, and clearly if you're expecting future recoveries under those mechanisms, how does it all tie in? And those are questions that are going to have to be answered as we move forward and do individual studies for every municipality. We certainly think that there will be the need for prioritization of capital works because there will be limits to how much you can fund. And so you're going to want to focus those revenues, but it does give you enhanced flexibility about how you address those needs. But it could also mean that there's increased discussion amongst various departments about what they see their prioritization to be. The accounting mechanisms are a little bit unclear. There at least is going to be one reserve fund under the CBC regime. It doesn't right now say there has to be split up into segments by service, but many municipalities may want to do that indeed. And so the reporting as well, I think it's going to be incumbent upon municipalities to try to illustrate and show that whether or not the revenue neutrality is being met. And if you're not collecting as much money as you anticipated you would have under the other prevailing mechanisms, we should be reporting that back to the ministry. So that's really the end of my formal presentation. We'd certainly be pleased to take any questions. And if you want to email me at any time, feel free to do so, and myself or one of my colleagues would be pleased to get back to you. Thanks for taking time to listen to the webinar, and that's all for now.